Så er klokken 7:15. Velkommen til jer, der har valgt at være her indenfor, selvom det er fantastisk dejligt vejr udenfor. Mit navn det er Bettina Lundgaard, og jeg koordinerer masteruddannelsen i IT øh, på tværs af de 3 vestdanske universiteter. Øh, jeg håber, I får mulighed for at nyde det gode vejr. Det gør vores studerende på Aarhus Universitet, fordi det er den store festdag oppe i Universitetsparken i dag. Så derfor sidder blandt andet Susan hjemme i dag. Det gør jeg også. Der er en del larm op på arbejde, og så kan man jo godt være lidt uheldig, at der også er lidt larm hjemme i haven, og det håber jeg, at I alle I bærer over med. I dag der skal I møde Susan Hilbolling, og Susan hun skal tale om practical strategies to turn chance into innovation. Og som I kan se, så foregår webinaret på engelsk, og det er ikke fordi Susan ikke godt kan forstå dansk, det kan Susan godt. Susan kommer fra Holland, men vi tænkte, det var nemmere måske kunne inkludere nogle flere. I er velkommen til at stille spørgsmål derfor på både dansk og engelsk. Og brug meget gerne chatten til det. Vi gør det, at vi optager webinaret. Vi har ikke besluttet os for, om vi deler det endnu. Det vil vi godt lige have lov til at kigge igennem efterfølgende. Så now in English, Susan, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bettina. All right, hope you can see me and the screen works, right?
It works. Yep.
Great. Okay. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining, especially this morning. So my name is Susan, as Bettina also said. I work at Aarhus University in the Department of Management. I'm an associate professor there, and I actually came to the department around 7 years ago, first to do a postdoc and then assistant, now associate professor. So kind of never left. And as you said, yeah, I understand most Danish. So if you have any questions at the end in Danish, that's also fine. But when it comes to research, it's a little bit easier to talk in English, simply because we do all our research in English, so it's very difficult to make that to use a lot of these terms in Danish. So actually, what I will be talking about today, actually, I couldn't even find a Danish word for it. So that's a little bit a small disclaimer. As Bettina mentioned, I'm also connected to the Master in IT hosted by IT West. I recently also took over the role of study leader or head of studies at Aarhus VSS. Next semester, I will be coordinating a course that's called Digital Innovation, Digital Transformation. And in this course, we will focus on how organizations can use emerging technologies for real advantages in their organizations, in their products, in their services, in their strategy or ways of working. And an exciting part of this course is that we will go on a study trip to London School of Economics in August. I'm very excited about it. It's really the thought leaders in our field that will be teaching us there. In addition, we will also have some guest lectures. So I think it will really be the frontier of what's going on in digital innovation, both in academia and in practice. So if you would like to join, don't wait too long because the deadline for applying is 1st. All right, so enough promotion for that. Let's now talk about research. And as you could maybe see from my profile on the slides here as well, is that my background is actually more into innovation than in IT. And actually, I think it actually makes sense. I slowly shifted since most innovation these days revolves around digital technology. So that's actually how I kind of shifted my focus. My research is typically exploratory, so I do in-depth qualitative case studies to really understand what is happening in organizations on the ground. And as a result of this approach, its focus is way more on discovery rather than testing hypotheses. I've also been studying a variety of topics depending on where the context leads me. And today I want to talk about a recent published paper that I worked on together with my co-author Pernilla that focuses on the role of surprise, on randomness, on luck, or what we call serendipity. A topic that actually hasn't received much scholarly attention. But before I get into it, let me start with a simple question. So when you think about where you are today, how much of that was really entirely because you had planned it? And I mean, not only just being here today, this webinar, but also think about the career that you imagined when you just graduated 20 years old. Maybe a strategy you wrote down, or the answer to a question, where do you see yourself in 5 years, that you typically get at a job interview. If that is the plan that exactly brought you here, you might be a little bit unusual, because I think for most of us, there's also something else at work. And that something else is what I want to talk about today. All right. But let me start with 2 stories about some famous innovations, products that you probably know, but maybe you don't know the detailed story behind them. So the first one is Alexander Fleming in 1928. He comes back from a holiday to find a petri dish on his desk that has been contaminated with mold. And interestingly, the bacteria around the mold are dead. So most colleagues, most scientists in the situation would just throw away that dish and start it again. But Fleming didn't. He stopped, he looked at it, and then he asked why. And that moment of noticing, so it's not the accident itself, is what actually became penicillin, which then changed medicine since then. And the second story I would like to tell you is that by Spencer Silver, a chemist at 3M in 1968. He created an adhesive that by any measure was a failure. It basically barely sticked, and no one could find a use for it. So it sat in the drawer for many, many years. And then a colleague at 3M, Art Fry, is singing in a church choir, and is losing his bookmark from the book that he's using. And then he remembered actually Silver's useless glue, and turns out actually that really weak adhesive wasn't really the problem. There was just no solution for it. There was just no use case for it. So that is actually how the Post-its were born. And these innovations are not alone. So if you think about Velcro, for example, Viagra, the microwave oven, there's many of these examples. But what is interesting here, and what I hope that you also notice from these stories, is that it wasn't just luck or completely randomness. They were actually experiencing something unexpected, but they were also doing something. And that is where it gets interesting, because we often tend to tell these stories as if it was only luck that was at work. And yes, of course, there is a chance element, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But if you really look closer at what really happened, in each case, there was also a prepared mind. There was some curiosity, rather than just dismissing what was not part of it. There was a connection made across domains, across time, across people, that maybe some others wouldn't have made. So the chance event was just a spark, but then it's the person that connects the dots. So, for example, if you think about winning a lottery, you could call that pure luck, right? You didn't really do anything about that. But then when we think about serendipity or smart luck, is when you notice a lottery ticket on the ground, that you pick it up, and that also that you know what to do with it. Yeah? So the definition that I want to work with today is around serendipity as the ability to make fortunate or beneficial discoveries from unexpected events. Again, this is not random. It's not a matter of just being at the right place at the right time. It is really what happens when an unexpected event needs a prepared encouragement. So where does the word serendipity come from? And it's actually rather nice origin. So I will just tell it very briefly, because it also tells you something important about what serendipity is about. So the word serendipity was coined by Horace Walpole in 1745 in a letter he wrote to a friend. And it was based on a Persian fairy tale called The Three Princes of Serendip. And Serendip is actually an old name for Sri Lanka. And in that tale, and again, I won't go into details, 3 princesses make repeatedly very clever discoveries of things that they were not looking for, things that they were not in quest. They were observing, but they were also inferring, and they were connecting things that others wouldn't connect. And that's actually the point, right? So these princes were not just passive. They were not just wandering around hoping that something interesting would happen. They were also sharp and attentive, and they were making connections. And that quality, being active, being prepared, being alert, that is really the essence of the word, where it comes from. But interestingly, management research, or even management practice, has actually ignored this. And how can we explain it? It's actually maybe not so surprisingly if you think. So management is a discipline that's really focused on, how can we perfect control, right? Think about strategies, KPIs, strategic planning, forecasting, project management, roadmaps, you name it, right? We've become really good at organizing and executing towards predefined goals, which is, of course, very relevant and important. But actually, serendipity, by definition, lives outside the plan. You cannot schedule for it. It just arrives. You cannot really put it in a plan. So it's maybe also not so surprising that research hasn't really focused on it. It's also interesting because most of the methods that we use are focused on things that we can measure, and also typically tries to reduce any variance if you think, for example, about experience. Another explanation could also be that typically in the stories that we tell to ourselves and maybe to others, we tend to present things way more linear than they were in reality. We tend to rationalize things when we view them retrospectively, not acknowledging and not learning actually from these unexpected twists and turns that underline many of these stories. But that has recently started to change. And I think after having studied serendipity myself for some time now, it is also practically relevant. So let me take you through what we know. And a researcher whose work has really boosted the interest in serendipity in recent years, and of course he was not the first, but he's been really, helping to bring this to the attention of many more researchers, is Christian Busch. And he has written also a book called The Serendipity Mindset. If you're interested, can recommend reading it. But he also published a comprehensive literature review in one of the leading journals in our field. So from a more academic perspective. And his central argument is rather straightforward. Again, as I said, serendipity, it's not random. It is also not a personality trait. It is something that you can practice, right? It's something that you can develop. It is a habit. And it also has some patterns. And learning from these patterns, we can actually become better at cultivating serendipity. So his starting point is really this, that unexpected events happen to everyone all the time. Every single day, things occur that are not part of it. But it's really about how you notice them and whether you do something. Yeah? So the chance event is simply just the trigger. So think about Fleming, who noticed the mold because the way he thought, right? Not just because the mold was there. His colleagues might have looked at the same contaminated dish and saw a problem. But he saw a question that was worth pursuing. Again, same event, but what Christian Busch would say a different. So what does this mindset actually consist of? So Busch points to a few habits that distinguish people who capture serendipity and those who don't. So first important one is curiosity. So being curious over dismissing things that were not part of it. So when something happens, a typical response in most organizations is actually to get back on track as quickly as possible. A serendipity response is different. It's to pause and to ask, why is this? As you can see with also the Fleming example, it is a small choice, but actually with significant outcomes. A second important one is also a tolerance for ambiguity. So think about the story of the Post-it notes. with Spencer Silver sitting with that glue that didn't work for years. He didn't force a conclusion, he just left it an open question. And most of us, and also most organizations, are rather uncomfortable with these kind of open questions, rather have a resolution. But serendipity actually requires you to sit with something unresolved, maybe a little longer than feels comfortable. And the third one is connecting across domains. And I think you can also understand why this is important, right? So it's important to think about something outside your immediate field. Can be both research, but also practice, right? So it means connecting also with people, reading outside your area, being curious about things that maybe do not immediately seem useful. And again, these are not personality traits. These are habits that you can do. And I want to pause here for a little personal reflection, because I think that makes it also a little bit more concrete. So if I think back about the journey where I'm now, I'd never imagined actually doing a PhD, not even know about becoming an associate professor after finishing my PhD, and especially not at a university in Denmark. And actually, I always struggled a little bit because I really felt uncomfortable for not having a plan, right? But I always felt, it's a little bit more realistic to be a little bit open, because there are so many things that happen that are outside your control. So for me, it always made sense to think more, maybe also to manage my own expectations, right? To think about opportunities that pop up and then act upon them one day. And now, after having studied serendipity, I realized that actually I wasn't, just being totally unstrategic, but probably was following more this serendipity mindset without knowing. And in fact, it actually makes sense. I always liked to dig into papers. I was always writing the boring reports. So maybe I had it in me anyway to be an academic. But there are many examples of this. So yesterday, for example, I had a meeting with someone that I hadn't spoken with for more than 10 years. We were doing horse riding together in the Netherlands during our studies, but she was Danish, and we connected over LinkedIn. And then in my feed, one day on LinkedIn, I saw that she shared something that was potentially maybe relevant for my research. So I wrote her a quick message. We connected again, had a chat yesterday. No concrete outcome at all, but who knows what this will lead to eventually. And I'm sharing this not because I think these are very dramatic stories, but I think because most of us have a version of this, right? And a question that I also wanted to ask you and think about, you don't have to answer it, but just an own reflection, is also to think about a turning point in your career that was not part of it. Yeah? A connection, an opportunity, maybe a conversation, an accidental conversation, but to think about what made you actually ready for it, to act upon that. And what were some of these conditions that enabled? So hold on to that thought, because I think what recent research has also pointed out is that serendipity is not just an individual level practice or an individual level mindset, but actually that we should see this actually slightly different. That is, for example, we think about serendipity often as we have this romantic image of, for example, Fleming, right? As a scientist, a lone scientist sitting there having some sort of eureka moment, a brilliant insight, which then leads to a breakthrough. But as you probably also got from the examples, and if you look closely, you will see that serendipity in practice is not really such a magical moment, right? And in fact, what recent research has also showed, including my own, is that there's two things that are also important when we want to understand serendipity. So the first one is that serendipity is distributed. It means serendipity involves not only just one individual, but multiple people. So to really create value from some serendipitous insight, you need multiple people involved. Think about the 3M Post-it example. And also, secondly, serendipity may take a long time to materialize. And so a chance event might just be a trigger, but then one also needs to act upon. And sometimes it means that it needs to sit in the drawer for some time before it's been acted upon. And again, to post the example illustrates this. So we've learned that to better understand how we can cultivate and organize for serendipity, we also need to take these aspects into account. So it's not just about how can we organize more of these change events or how can we develop an individual mindset. It's also to think about, how can we enable this distributed and long time to materialize. And to answer that question, I want to draw on a study that, as I said, my colleague Pernilla and I have recently published about. It is a study of that took 5 years, so it's a longitudinal case study of a pharmaceutical company, which we called Pharmaco, a pseudonym for confidentiality reasons, that participated in a pre-competitive interdisciplinary research consortium. So in this research consortium, there were also competitors and different academic institutions from around. And this consortium that they participated in was highly regulated because, on the one hand, it's the pharmaceutical industry, but also because they got EU funding. And the grant agreement alone, I actually have a copy, a printed hard copy of it. It's a book that's actually 3 times thicker than my PhD dissertation. So that spells out all the things that they have to deliver, all the objectives. So our original focus with this study was actually not serendipity, but it was on how knowledge flows from these open innovation, what we call them, these consortia, to inside the organization. But then when we started collecting data, quite early on, we started noticing actually that these participants that we interviewed were very enthusiastic about all the things that were not part of the plan. So this triggered our interest, right? To really better understand, okay, well, in a context that's so highly regulated and predefined, how are they able to pursue these unexpected insights further and to create value over them? And we actually found that this organization that we studied was actually really good at that, despite the conditions. And it happened through a set of very specific recurring practices that the people involved were doing over time, maybe without even knowing that they were. So it's beyond the scope of today's seminar to really go in depth with the model that we developed. But I just wanted to briefly show it, and that's why I included it anyway, because I think it nicely represents a little bit what we. So we developed a process model here, which starts at the bottom where they were working on a problem related to the consortium. The consortium is in the bottom, what we call a serendipity arrangement. And then over time, through different episodes, different interactions across people, what seems to be a problem related to a task, over time leads to something that was very important for the organizational strategy of the main company. Yeah? So just to give you an example, starting at the bottom on the left, was a PhD who was sitting with a problem when she was designing her PhD study. So it's a PhD that was part of the research consortium. So she sits with a literature review. It was also COVID time, so maybe she was sitting with the literature a little bit longer than she would normally do. And she stumbles upon a paper from a completely different field, but that uses a technique to make 3D images of her brain that could actually solve her problem. And then she proposes the idea to her supervisor. But the problem emerged that no university in the UK where she was had this equipment. She mentioned it at an ordinary online work package status meeting where actually one of the senior scientists at Pharmaco participated. And when she heard the problem, she actually vaguely remembered that Pharmaco actually had that machine. And she was able to then, after that meeting, connect to the person who was responsible. But that turns out that the machine actually hadn't been used so much in recent years because there were no resources. There were no people available to really use that machine. So the interest from the PhD was actually an opportunity to work with it again. They found a use case for it and also some resources because the PhD could actually do the work. Yeah. So a new person was brought into the consortium who could then actually help this PhD student run the analysis. So this was a win-win for everyone. But again, not part of the plan, but still acted upon. And this story continues, right? This was just one episode, but it's really this accumulation of these different episodes over time as these small but unintended things actually turn out to have big beneficial side effects. So looking across different of these episodes in our data and different of these cases of serendipitous discoveries, we identified 4 different practices that consistently appear. And we call that serendipity. So I'll just briefly talk you through each of them. So the first practice is what we call deep diving. And deep diving means sitting with something long enough to develop really deep knowledge on a topic. So just the PhD student I was just presenting in the example. But we also had another instance of a senior leader in Pharma Co. who had to deep dive into something that was outside his normal task because the one responsible for it was out of office. We're on summer holidays. So he spent his summer holidays learning about something that he would otherwise have. The second practice is listening in. And listening in means being present in conversations in spaces beyond your immediate task. It's really about paying attention to what is being said. And this can be anything, right? It's not a focused way of looking for something, but just broad attention. So an example that we saw is also steering committee meetings were an important vehicle for that. So steering committee members who were sitting in these meetings, just getting a very general update, were actually really good, listening in. So the next one is connecting. And that's actually an important one that others have also pointed out is really to connect these dots, right? So to link an observation, maybe from a steering committee to an opportunity or to a person elsewhere. As the senior scientist in the example knew, okay, I can connect you to that other person. And maybe there's something there. And the last one is implementing. And that's maybe the most underrated practice. We also saw that if implementing is not acted upon, or if the serendipitous discovery is not acted upon, that these serendipitous discoveries, they come to die, right? So implementing typically means something like bringing in more resources, for example. It can be even a small step before a moment passes. And it also requires a certain flexibility. So as in the example where they pull in a new person, that was actually something that the company was really good at. So they really had some resource flexibility there. So there were not these rigid structures that, whoever was in the grant proposal from day one, that they could also switch out. So, and I think what is interesting is that these practices, they don't happen in one single instant, right? Not just this one moment. They unfold over time, sometimes months, sometimes years. And as you can also see, they can be encouraged and you can develop them. You can also support them through different structures. And interestingly, you could also say, well, these are very mundane, very everyday, very ordinary practices. And that's actually, we actually got, it's an interesting story. When we submitted a journal, we got it back from the editor. She was actually commenting on that, what we found, it's not really exciting. So, and instead of seeing that as a harsh comment or a harsh critique, we actually turned that around. And then we thought, okay, yeah, she's right? This is actually not super, magical or anything. And that's also why we framed the paper in the end, calling it demystifying serendipity, because it's actually, in fact, it's really in these everyday, ordinary things that we do. but everything needs to be in place. All right, so what can organizations and managers do to make to benefit more from serendipity, or make the chances for serendipity to happen more likely? So, in drawing on Bush's work and my own findings, I would like to point out a couple of things. So first one is the importance of slack and space. Yeah, so people need some time, some unscripted time that's not dedicated to something or allocated to something or tied to a specific deliverable. So 3M and Google, there's more examples of that. For example, they have this rule where they can spend 15% of the time that is not allocated to something specific. And that's a structural condition that, for example, made the Post-it notes, the discovery and the development of Post-it notes possible. And actually, most organizations have trying to systematically remove all that slack in the name of efficiency. Also, when I did my data collection in another case, I was talking to someone who was very much into Lean and Scrum, and who really didn't want me to get involved because I was considered waste, right? So really trying to cut out everything that's not related to the planned objective, I think that doesn't really fit so with a serendipity mindset. So the second one is the importance of psychological safety. People also, there needs to be a culture or an atmosphere where people feel comfortable speaking up, saying that they found something strange or that something had failed actually. And that must be welcome. Right? That doesn't need to be redirected back into the agenda. So important to have some kind of culture that actually sets, that actually encourages things that are not part of the planner also well. And that actually people feel comfortable reporting. So the third one is campus design, but also related to the second one is really how can you facilitate these diverse networks where people run into each other that maybe would otherwise not. So important, famous examples are that is also how you design your campus, right? Not with people, computer scientists in one department, and then on the other side of campus, we have the management people, but how can we facilitate spaces where people run into each other so that these cross domain interactions can take place? And I put here a picture from a conference from IT West that I think these events, attending these moments, interacting with people, running into people, is an important enabler for serendipity. Because serendipity often lives where these different worlds meet. And organizations that only connect people with same background and same role might actually risk closing off some of that opportunities for these unexpected to happen. So there's one more dimension maybe worth addressing, especially since we're here related to the master in IT and IT West, right? Is that of IT and digital technologies. And this was not part of my research, and I could actually also not really find a lot of research on this. But of course, we can think about this, right? With everything that we just heard about. So to think about this question of whether IT or digital technologies can be an enabler or a barrier to serendipity. So for example, I think on the one side, I think these digital tools can actually be powerful enablers. So collaboration platforms can actually create some kind of ambient awareness of what colleagues elsewhere in the organization or outside your organizations are working on, which is very much related to this listening in practice that we identified in our study. I practice this a lot, I think myself as well, right? When you're on LinkedIn and you read certain things that you were not looking, but could actually trigger. Maybe not now, but perhaps in the future. Also access to global networks, but also the storage of ideas on internal wikis can actually be an important one to store, for example, these discoveries that maybe there's no direct use for today, but maybe in the future, just to make sure that they don't get lost. But at the same time, maybe these technologies could also work against serendipity. Think about these recommendation algorithms that are designed to show you things, to show you more things that you already know, right? To get you in these like very narrow bubbles. But also think about our attention span that has definitely decreased. You know, as you probably also experience yourself, right? It's very difficult also to make sure that there's time for slow research or for slow work to sit with a problem for a little bit longer. And again, as I also said, right, are we too much focused on optimizing away anything that is not efficient, right? Yes, and the last one is also to think, for example, about remote work or online conferences. Do we really, it definitely creates opportunities for example, for us today, right? But it's maybe not exactly the same experience as having a networking event in real life or meeting your colleagues at the coffee machine that you would otherwise not meet. All right, so let us go back to where we started. So I asked you if you're here today because of your plan. And my guess is that the honest answer for most of us is partly, right? The rest involved something that wasn't part of the plan. Precision, a coincidence, maybe a problem that turned out not to be a problem after all, but an opportunity. And then lastly to say, right, so what I sketched out today maybe sounds very rosy and optimistic, but I also believe it's very realistic. It's a realistic view of the world and actually also provides hope. So I'd like to end this talk with a quote from Bush at the end of the book, which I think summarizes it quite nicely. So he wrote, "It's time to let go of the old idea that success results only come from either blind luck or skill. Instead, we can work hard to develop that mindset and the conditions for active and smart luck to happen." So I hope this call or this this talk gave you some new ideas, maybe a way of seeing the world instead of very concrete practices, but some inspiration for how you can organize maybe your own life, your own career, but also your organization, and maybe even facilitate serendipity for others. So thank you, and looking forward to your questions.